Hello, this is Julie again. This is Seminar 3 and this is the first part of the lecture. I'm just going to talk about Rothman's typology for community work, and before I start doing that I just wanted to also reiterate the learning activities, the Module 1 learning activity that people have submitted online, and that if people have any questions or concerns about submitting the next one before March the 27th, please let me know, because it's a requirement for the course that you submit each of the learning activities through LearnLine, even though each second one will be marked. Not every one is marked, but the one due on the 27th of March will be marked, and it must be in by that date. So just reminding people about that, and please contact me if you perceive you have any problems with that. Well, we're going to talk about the different types of community work, and Rothman's typology is really looking at grouping community work into 3 sections, and they are community development, social planning and social action. I'm looking at the PowerPoint slide number 2 for this seminar. One of the things that we did in the class was actually discuss amongst ourselves about what people thought were the differences between those 3 different types of community work, and we'll be exploring those further. On slide 3 there's a quote that really gives an explanation, I guess, of what a model is. And this quote describes a model as a set of directives which state how any given kind of treatment or approach will be carried out. And a model is basically definitional and descriptive, and it usually states what the practitioner is expected to do or what the practitioners would normally do in certain circumstances. So for example, casework models normally include some delineation of the kinds of problems or disorder for which they're intended, the methods of diagnosis and assessment, and the desired ways of relating to clients, and statements of treatment goals and strategies. So models similarly describe the way that community work is to be done. So we're going to look at different ways of thinking about community work, and one of the things that you need to be very conscious of when you're studying this is that while these definitions, models, descriptions of types of community work exist, that there often will be some overlap and interconnection between them, that they're not necessarily quite separate. And even Rothman, who developed this typology, talks about the notion of softening models. So in other words, becoming less stringent or less strict about each model being so separate from the other, and that's also acknowledging that there'll be overlaps and intersection of the different approaches. So we're going to look at those terms that you're quite familiar with now from the readings: community work, community development, community organisation, community action, community practice and community change. All of those terms are often used interchangeably, but it's important for this unit for us to become confident and familiar with describing different types of community work and being very clear about what we mean when we talk about them. I'm going to slide 5, and we're looking at Rothman's 3 models of community work. The first one typically is community development, or the other term for that is locality development. The thing that stands out this type of community work from others is that it's very much grassroots or from the ground up. So coming from people's initiatives, coming from people's concerns. Usually a wide number of people are involved in community development. It also can involve planning, implementation and evaluation. Emphasis is very much on the democratic procedures. People are part of it because they choose to be part of it, it's often about network building, skill development. Self-help is part of community development work, and looking at local leadership capacity and educational objectives. So what are the benefits? What are the learning that people can expect from being part of that process? Some of the terms that you would perhaps have heard referred to in community development is community capacity building, asset-based community development, neighbourhood development, strengths-based community work, and international work. One way of describing one of these asset-based community development is I'm holding up to you a glass of water, and that glass of water, it's not full, it's half full. It's also half empty. One of the ways of describing asset-based community development is about focusing on the half full nature of that glass, not focusing on the half empty. So asset-based community development, for example, acknowledges that there's already strengths, there's already assets, there's already things happening in the community that can be built on and strengthened by community development activities. The next method that we're looking at is social or community planning, and this is distinctly different in that usually social planning involves a rational, a deliberate, planned, a technical process of problem solving. So looking at a particular issue or a problem and what might be some key steps or ways to address that problem. And I'm looking at slide 7 on the PowerPoint. And the degree of community participation might vary with this. Often it includes a community that's being consulted with. So professionals will often carry out those activities and go to a community, go to a group of people, go to a street, go to a neighbourhood, and say, we've come here to talk to you about this particular problem. One example for describing this is in the state of Victoria, where I was running a housing advocacy service. The public housing, or the government that provided public housing for people, was recognising that lots of the houses were in very poor condition and that they needed to address them. In fact, some of the houses were in such poor condition that the houses needed to be knocked down in parts of Bendigo. The way that the department, so it's a government department of housing, addressed this was by having a consultation with the people who lived in some of those houses, so the tenants. They invited the tenants to come to a meeting and to talk to them about the poor quality of the houses, and also to talk about what they plan to do, how they were planning to demolish some of those houses and rebuild houses in other areas. That's an example of social planning because it was organised. The consultation was carried out by a government department. They were addressing the problem. They were consulting with the community. They weren't necessarily interested in building the capacity of the tenants or the residents. They wanted to get some feedback from them. They wanted to be able to indicate that they had consulted with them. Then they would go away after that process and usually write a report with recommendations. So the social planning or community planning process can be quite technical and often, but not always, is carried out by experts or by professionals. The other mode that we're looking at is social action. And social action is something, an activity that often comes from a group of people who are experiencing a problem. Often it's people who are disadvantaged and who organise themselves to make a statement, to address the issue by challenging, whether it be their employer, the government, a department, to bring their issue to their attention, to demand for changes. It's usually about addressing social inequity. There's a focus on democratic participation and how can people actually get access to better resources and get access to power to participate in decision making. And it's often an action that comes from the ground up. It's often linked with broader social movements. So an example could be environmental movement, the refugee movement. There'll be rallies, marches, boycotts, and now with the advent of internet and social media, that's often used to assist people to organise social actions. So social action is, again, quite a particular mode of community work that is often initiated by the people who are experiencing the problem themselves or who have a passionate desire to see that issue addressed. On slide 9, there's just a table there that really highlights the difference between these different groupings of community work. Community development has specific goals that are usually around capacity building, network building, focus on the process very much, the way in which things are conducted, the way in which meetings are conducted, the way in which people are informed. The process is very strongly part of the whole driver with community development. And in social planning, it's usually a focus to solve a particular problem, and it can be very task oriented. How are we going to get there? What do we need to do to get there? It's very much about steps, particularly addressing the issue through looking at what the needs are and how decisions need to be made to cope with that, address and change that issue. And social action, as I was just saying, it's really about addressing power, looking at social change through the actions of people being organised and addressing it together. So the goals and the assumptions of each of these particular models is slightly different. However, one of the things that I want to emphasise is that there can be an overlap and with each of these, and not to think of one as mutually excluding the other. Some of the characteristics or the tactics that are used in these different models, for example, community development, very strong emphasis on consensus, communication, sharing information, coming to decisions as a group, discussion amongst diverse groups of people, about inclusiveness, about consulting as widely as possible. And the role of the worker in community development is very much as a facilitator, a networker. Sometimes it might be event management, sometimes it's a group worker facilitating groups. When we look at social planning, we're looking at consensus or conflict. They're the characteristics or the tactics that might be used. And the practitioner or the worker's role there is often more as a researcher or an expert, someone who's coming in specifically to deal with that particular issue or that particular problem. When we're looking at social action, the characteristics and the tactics used there are conflict, direct action, confrontational, and about negotiating for an outcome. The role of a worker or a practitioner in that can be as an advocate, organiser, media liaison, and again using event management. So that table is there for you to have a look at and to see how the distinct goals of each of those models stands and what are some of the assumptions behind them, and also what are the expected outcomes. So in Australia, most of the paid working communities usually falls into the community or the locality development category. A lot of volunteer work in Australia is done in the social action category. A lot of community members are part of different social actions, and much international work will fit around the social planning category, including the work that is done often in Aboriginal communities in Australia. So I'll finish there, just talking about the different models of community work and consider the different ways that different types of community work appeal to you, because that's what you're going to be talking about in your first assignment. Thank you.